World Championships have concluded, and I'm here to tell you to not copy any of the decks that you saw in the World Championship. Hello guys, and welcome back to another cold episode. On today's episode, I wanted to quickly discuss the reasoning behind basically my explanation of this video, or more specifically the title and the thumbnail. That being, no, you should not copy the decks that ended up winning or just doing well in any of these events. Why? And maybe with a few exceptions. So I want to go over Worlds over all three of the formats, Duel Links, Master Duel, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Or more specifically the TCG / OCG. And I want to explain more specifically why Worlds is not a great way to determine a deck that you should play, nor the exact cards that you should be using. So first and foremost, we got to talk about the formats. With the TCG, which I want to talk about first, with the TCG, the format was a mismatch of different ban lists and released and unreleased cards in everywhere. Which basically means a lot of cards that you would expect to be legal to play, like for example, Gold Pride, just aren't, because they're not released everywhere, right? Even things as simple as Yu-Gi-Oh! Friendship and Unity have not been released in every region, therefore, technically they're unplayable. And similarly, the ban list actually does hit things that would normally see play. For example, Maxi is at 3 in the OCG. Same with Master Plan. Same with Rodent Totem, I believe. I think Rodent Totem is at 3 as well. Same with a myriad of these other things, right? Wandering Griffin Rider, however, is completely legal in the TCG. It's banned here. Do you want to know why? Because it's banned in the OCG. So when you're mixing and matching all of these different various bans that are different from the OCG and the TCG and throwing them together, you get a format that isn't really what you're expecting to play, either in the TCG or in the OCG. It's kind of this weird mismatch, right? So, for example, Bestial Dragon Link ended up winning the event. And if you don't know, this was the first United States win ever at a World Championship. So, shout out to Paul. It was an amazing run and super entertaining to watch. However, Bestial Dragon Link isn't good in the OCG, like at all. It's decent, but not nearly the best deck in the TCG as well. And even when you look at this list, this isn't even a list you would see in the TCG, right? Because the Bestials are all at 1. That's not something we have in the TCG. We have them all free and completely unlimited, right? But because of the OCG list tampering with it as well, it does mean that your list has to be slightly different. In fact, very different, as you can see here. On top of that, things like the extra deck and what have you may be missing or having less cards or having more cards, right? For example, again, Striker Dragon is currently at 1 in the TCG, but is entirely unlimited in the OCG, so another big difference to consider. So even just when building a literal winning deck list, you see a lot of problems, right? Also, because of that, the meta, and specifically like the hand traps and stuff like that, are not going to be conducive to other types of formats. Sure, Joel and Lockbird might be a good card in the TCG, but also maybe it's not really worth it to play in the main deck, and you can put it in the side deck, right? Same with Nibiru. I think Nibiru right now isn't exactly all that great to be main decking in the TCG, but alas, main decking it for here, especially given the fact that a lot of these are combo decks, did seem to make a lot of sense, right? And then if we scroll down, we have things like Rika Sun Avalon as well, which again, I mean, if you're going to play Rika, you're going to play Rika. This honestly didn't change much. I think the only thing that changed is maybe the extra No, I think literally nothing changed. Maybe hand trap lineups, but I think this deck is basically untouched, so an exception to the rule, but something that honestly could have been played at any point in this similar fashion. Moving on, MathMech. MathMech has also kind of changed. I believe that we're missing a few cards from some of the more recent sets for like Cyber stuff to be a little bit better, but I think this is honestly also pretty much what you could expect in the TCG. However, it's not going to be nearly as good because, again, Bestials are not limited. On top of that, I just think that the power level of the TCG is a lot higher, and the power of the OCG means that you'd have to play through Maxi, which makes MathMech just not really a good option, right? Etc., right? The list goes on. Especially when you look at like Branded. Branded is just completely limited, so it's not really worth it to look at this and then just be like, oh, I'm just going to throw in the other cards, because it's like, oh, I'd have to change my deck dramatically, right? Oh, I could play triple Magnemite in the TCG. I can play triple Lubellion if I really want to. Now, granted, maybe you don't want to. That's up to you. But it's like, I can play triple Branded Fusion, I think. You know, I can play triple Opening. I can play, you know, the triple Crossouts to actually have an out with Ash Blossom and stuff like that. So it's like, maybe you don't fill up with, like, a bunch of random one-ofs, like the Ghost Spell, or the Imperm, or what have you, or the Nadir Servant package, right? I saw this a whole bunch because of branded players not actually being able to actually play most of the rest of their cards. For example, you know, the Branded Fusion and the Branded Open, right? Sprite is, I think, only starter is at 2 in the TCG, so Sprite is basically untouched, so that's a very, very playable deck, and you don't have to play it with something like Tri-Brigade. You could play it more pure, or with, like, Runic Furhire, or what have you, right? So, lots of different things to just consider with the TCG. Again, very different ban list, as you see here. Very different. Lots of different things that are changed. Lots of things that you would expect, you know? But a lot of things that you're just like, wow, these are limited, right? Anyway, moving on to Master Duel. Now, Master Duel also had World Finals. This was won by Snipe Hunters, the European team, with Joshua Schmidt, Quantal Think, as well as EMRE, which played a very different style of game as well. First of all, it's a team format, which immediately means the decks are going to be significantly different, or at least different enough, right? Sometimes people will play just like regular decks, and the team format basically doesn't change things. Like, for example, when there was that team YCS, when Kashtira had just released, and everyone was basically playing Kashtira, and in fact, the finals was won by literally 3 Kashtira decks, which was very funny. But here, the format is significantly different. Immediately, you can see shared cards. If you don't know, you have to share cards between all of your decks. You don't have to share them, but you can only share these specific cards throughout your decks. That means for these players, for the number 1 first place team, they could only use Ash, Maxi, and Triple Tack as a repeating card in all of their decks. So Maxi, Ash, and Triple Tack are the only cards that you will see across all or any of their decks. All of the rest of them have to be unique from any of the other decks across all 6 decks, right? So if I play the limited to 1 Bestial Magnemite, the Exorcister player can't play that, right? Or the Sprite player or the Tier player can't play that card, right? Because it's that 1, and I can only play 1 across all of the decks. Or, for example, if I wanted to play, I don't know, say, Lubellion, right? I could play 2, and then a branded player could play 1, right? So do you see where the problem arises? You gotta build your decks accordingly. So if I want to play an Effect Veiler, I could only play the 1. If another player also wants to play it, like for example, Sky Striker, if they wanted to play the Veiler, they could only play 2, because I have the other one, right? So when coming up with decks, 1, you need to also consider that this is a known deck format. So if I build a deck, I know the other decks that other people are playing because they've shown it. We've seen it. We know what they're playing, right? So now I can play the deck. I can choose whatever deck I want to play out of the 2 decks, and I can choose whichever one. And then whatever one, has a better matchup for me. And since I'm going into a team format, there's a likelihood that I will have, maybe a bad matchup. Like, for example, if I'm playing Tier and my opponent is playing Exosister, that's just going to be an issue. Maybe I want to switch up the decks, etc., right? So again, a very, very different format. So when you're building a deck and when you're looking at this deck, it's not going to look good. I'm just gonna say it. It's not going to look great, right? There are better deck lists and other players who are also very good at specific decks that you could get other deck lists from. I'm just saying, for the World Championship, maybe it's not worth it, right? Now, granted, if you were to actually play this format, these are phenomenal deck lists to look at, right? Dragon Link did exceptional in the World Championship. It was one of the most well-performing decks, along with Tier, which we kind of expected, at least out of Tier. but it was a big surprise for Dragon Link. And I think the big reason for this was because of its spectacular matchup against Tier. And since everyone was basically having at least one member playing Tier, it was nice to have that one matchup that was good against Tier. So basically everyone had that one matchup, right? Exo Sister, the Tier, and then, of course, the Dragon Link. So, yeah, stuff like that. You also had Sprite, which did pretty well, which was played by, the second place team. Surprisingly, it wasn't played by this team, but they decided to play Sky Striker for some reason. I don't know. But yeah, there's tons of things like that where it's like, here we have the one Dark Ruler, randomly. But, there's also Sword Soul in here, because guess what? You can play a whole bunch of going second cards, like Lightning Storm and Red Reboot, in order to more effectively go second. So again, when considering the other deck lists and the other play styles or what have yous, this isn't really going to be the greatest for copying decks or what have you, or even just looking at, because the format is so vastly different, right? And then let's talk about Duel Links. Now, notably, Duel Links had a kind of silly ban list or format as well, where similarly to Master Duel, you couldn't share cards across the different decks, and you had to have like 2 legendary decks with legendary duelists, which basically meant that like you had to have a very specific amount of cards that like you utilized from a specific character. So for example, if you used Yugo, you had to basically use a certain amount of Speedroid cards, etc., etc. So there's that. So it's kind of weird, but similarly, you couldn't share cards between the 5 different decks, and it was a 5-deck format, and you could only use 1 deck per duel. So for example, if I used in the first duel the hero deck and I lost with it, I still couldn't use it for the next duel. So in that best of 5, I'd have to play basically all of the 5 decks if we went to those 5 games, if that makes sense. So kind of weird, but that's how it works. And because of that, again, we're seeing some interesting cards, like, for example, Expendable Die. Now, this isn't a bad card in the Duel Links sphere for heroes, especially with Destiny Effect and the insane effect that it actually does have, but Expendable Die honestly isn't all that great. And the reason for this is because, like, you are losing out on advantage just to destroy and to draw a card. Yeah, that's decent, but it's one of those things that's more of a tech card specifically for, it seems like more of a tech card specifically for this event than it is necessarily just a generically good card. We're also seeing things like Warning Point, which isn't seeing as much play, like the one-ofs here in Forbidden Chalice and Paleozoic Canadia, as well as other such things, so that you can put more of them in other decks. For example, here's the other 2 Chalice, here's the other Book of Moon, etc., etc. Right? So lots of these weird kind of numbers, right? We also saw from the finals Crusadia. Now, granted, Crusadia isn't actually all that great of a deck. However, what it does do, and why it won the finals, was due to the fact that it didn't clash in terms of cards that it used with any other of those top meta decks. We saw a lot of Hero, we saw a lot of Pendulum, we saw a lot of Orchist, and of course we saw a lot of Speedroid. However, that 5th deck really did clash and kind of steal staples if it was something else like we saw down here with I believe it was Trickstar, or with other such Orcus builds, or what have you, right? So when you look at it that way, yeah, Crusadia is pretty decent, but maybe it's not worth it to copy this one in particular. Maybe you wanted to use some other cards. Maybe you don't want to use exactly this list, right? Maybe you don't want triple Crusadia power. While it's good, maybe you don't want 3 of it. Maybe you want more Forbidden Lance, or more, maybe you want like a Chalice or something like that, right? And similarly with the extra deck, maybe instead of this Rostalegger, maybe you want a different monster that you could potentially utilize more effectively. Like, for example, a Nightmare Phoenix or something like that. But alas, if you have it in a bunch of other decks, you're not really going to be able to use that, right? So, similarly, kind of watch out for that. However, I will say, in Duel Links, I think it matters significantly less than in the other two formats. I feel like Master Duel's format is just so vastly different that, like, playing this exact list just kind of doesn't feel good. Like, there's no call by, there's no cross out, there's nothing like that to really answer Max C, so you just kind of die sometimes to Max C. Whereas, if you look at something like this, it's like, there's not really any of those big staples that needs to see play in any of the decks in particular. Like, for example, you could actually probably just take this list and you'd do pretty well, right? With the Destiny heroes. Similarly with the with Speedroids, this is a very good list that you could absolutely just take and plug in. Obviously not after the ban list, but beside the point. So lots of stuff like that where it's like, yeah, this one in particular, I think just this event in general works a little bit better, mostly due to the fact that, like, there are more cards available to you as staples or as generic replacements that you could easily throw in. For example, maybe you don't want Ring of Destruction, maybe you want more Book of Moons or stuff like that, but, you know, you don't have to worry about where your Book of Moons are placed. Instead of Paleozoic Canonia, just throw in the 3 Book of Moons into this one deck. Like, it's not really that big of a deal. Go for it, right? So there's lots of stuff like that where I think in Duel Links it matters a little bit less. But all things considered, I thought that the finals, or more specifically that the Yu-Gi-Oh! World Championship, was very interesting. And I just kind of wanted to come out here and be like, don't copy these decks. They're not actually all that great for the standard ban lists and the standard formats that we normal plebeians have to play in. But thoroughly enjoyed the finals. Thoroughly enjoyed all of the duels, except for Duel Links Dear Atlanta. That finals was so bad. And also, Master Duel had like 2 good games, now that I'm thinking about it, but yikes. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. That's going to be it for this episode. If you did enjoy it, a like is very much so appreciated, and if you want to check out more content like this, as well as more Yu-Gi-Oh!, then just be sure to subscribe. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and remember to always stay frosty. Bye-bye. Shout out to the Frost Guard, my members. Thank you guys so much for the support, and I hope you enjoy the content.